I am one of those unfortunate souls that deals with autoimmune disease. This is uncurable, and this is something that I deal with every single day of my life. It's unfortunate, but it's something that I can live with. There are some diseases that kill. There's some diseases that scar. Mine are invisible. And then there's those diseases that become so terrifying and so ordinary, and yet so woven into everyday life that people begin to speak of them almost the way they speak of the bad weather. Smallpox was one of those. For centuries, it moved through cities and villages with a kind of merciless familiarity. It struck down kings and beggars, infants and grandparents, the rich and the best linens, and the poor and whatever happened to be wearing at the time that their fever began. It came with vomiting, pain, weakness, heat in the way of fevers, and then it covered the body in eruptions that turned into blisters, then pustules, then hard scabs. And if it didn't kill you outright, it often left you marked forever. Faces were changed. Eyes were blinded and destroyed and ruined. Lives were split in two different parts. There was before the smallpox and after it. It's hard for us to imagine now, in the world where the disease is gone, to really fully understand what it meant to live with something like that, always waiting in the crowd. And yet on May 14th of 1796, in rural England, one doctor looked at this old horror and decided not to merely treat it, not to merely fear it, but he wanted to try to outwit it. That doctor was Edward Jenner. And what makes his story so extraordinary is that it did not begin with a giant laboratory or some grand government project or a glittering scientific machine. It began with observation, with country gossip, with dairy work and milkmaids and sore hands and the stubborn feeling that perhaps inside one disease was the shield against another. And that sounds almost absurd when you first hear it. It sounds like one of those old stories that should end with someone shaking their head and saying, well, that was a mad idea. But instead, it became the foundation of one of the greatest medical breakthroughs in human history. A killer that had tormented humanity for centuries was about to meet an enemy it never saw coming. And yes, strangely enough, that enemy had something to do with cows. But before we get to Jenner, we need to sit for a moment with smallpox itself, because without understanding the sheer scale of this terror, the daring of what happened in 1796 kind of loses some of its punch. Smallpox was caused by the variola virus, and it had likely been stalking human beings in some form for thousands of years. Scholars, even to this day, still debate how far back it goes. But there's credible evidence reaching into ancient history. Traces have been associated with Egyptian mummies. Ancient medical writings from India and China describe diseases that sound very much like smallpox. But by the time early modern world rolled around, smallpox was no mystery. This was a reoccurring human catastrophe that people, unfortunately, were getting kind of used to. How unfortunate would that be? In 18th century Europe alone, it's estimated that hundreds of thousands of people died from smallpox every single year. That's not over a lifetime. That's not over a century. That's in a single year. 1/3 of all blindness in Europe has been attributed to smallpox in some periods of history. Think about that. An entire continent and 1/3 of the blindness is connected to a single disease. In the 20th century alone, long after Edward Jenner and the long after medical science had begun to transform, smallpox is thought to have killed hundreds of millions of people. Even in the 1960s, the disease still caused millions of cases every year. So when we say this was a monster, we're not speaking poetically, we're speaking statistically. It was awful. It was also one of history's greatest disfigurers. The disease did not always kill you, but survival did not necessarily mean escape. If you lived, you might still carry the signature forever. Smallpox scars were not exactly subtle. They could mark the face in deep pits and patterns. There are a couple of actors out there that actually have these. You might spot one on Battlestar Galactica. Survivors could lose their eyesight or need glasses for the rest of their lives. Children who came through this might have their futures quietly reshaped by what the disease had done to them. They would be avoided, treated like a pariah. In a world where appearance could govern marriage prospects and employment and reputation and daily treatment, surviving smallpox could mean living inside its aftermath. And smallpox did not merely kill individuals, it altered history. When Europeans carried diseases, including smallpox, into the Americas, the local populations suffered catastrophic losses. Whole communities were devastated. Power balances shifted. Conquests, of course, became easier. Empires expanded over landscapes already broken by infection. The diseases did not ask who is brave or noble or wealthy or devout or educated or powerful. It just arrived, and then history bent around it. But here's the grim part. Before vaccination, people were not helpless, but their best defense was itself dangerous. That earlier method was called inoculation or variolation. The basic idea was to take material from a person with smallpox and deliberately introduce it to the body of a healthy person, usually through a cut on the skin or in some places through the nose. You're snorting somebody's pus. This is nasty. The hope was that the recipient would develop a milder form of the disease and survive it and then become immune to it. And often that did work, as gross as it is. But imagine the level of desperation required for society to settle on the following medical strategy. Let's give you a little bit of the thing that may horribly kill you, because that may be safer than waiting for it to find you naturally. That was where humanity was in history. That's not some fringe custom either. Inoculation had been practiced in parts of Asia long before it became part of Europe. China had forms of it. The Ottoman world was familiar with it. Eventually even reaching Britain in the early 18th century, thanks in part to Lady Mary Worley Montagu, who had seen it done in Constantinople and recognized that it might have some value. That mattered enormously because she had watched smallpox kill her brother, and it even scarred her own face. She did not need to be convinced that the disease was serious. She already knew. She experienced it firsthand. Inoculation, for all its risks, offered some sense of hope, at least. But the risks were real. Some people died from this inoculation. Some developed full cases of smallpox. Some spread it to others. So even when medicine was trying to protect people, it was still gambling with live ammunition. The procedure lowered the risk compared to ordinary infection and didn't remove it. That's an important distinction because Edward Jenner's work was not the beginning of the idea of prevention. It was the beginning of something much better. It was the turning of a terrifying medical compromise into a far safer and more elegant answer. Jenner himself is a fascinating figure, not just because he bursts onto the story as a theatrical genius. He was not one of those larger-than-life men who enter the room already sounding like they know that they belong in the history books. He was born in 1749 in Berkeley, Gloucestershire, the son of a clergyman. He trained in medicine, apprenticed under a local surgeon, and then studied in London under a man by the name of John Hunter, one of the most important surgeons and anatomists of the age. Hunter's advice to him was simple and memorable. Do not merely think, try. That's as close to a scientific battle cry as one can get without pounding a lab bench. So Jenner also had a keen interest in natural history. This mattered more than it might seem. He studied birds. He observed behavior. He thought carefully about how things worked in the real world, not just in books. He noticed patterns, and he paid attention when country people said something curious. That combination of formal medical training and practical observational curiosity made him exactly the sort of person who could hear an old rule belief and ask, not necessarily, is this silly, but rather, could this be true? And one of those rule beliefs concerned milkmaids. There was a common saying that milkmaids who had caught cowpox did not get smallpox. So, cowpox was a disease that infected cows and could pass it to humans, especially those who worked closely with cattle. It was unpleasant, yes. It could produce sores and make people feel really unwell, but it was far milder than smallpox. And the milkmaids, according to the popular lore of the locals, often kept their smooth complexions because they did not later suffer the pitted face of smallpox survivors. Now, that sounds almost quaint when it's repeated today. It sounds like a piece of folklore, of course, tucked into the corner of a country kitchen. But it was a sort of folklore that might contain a hidden mechanism, maybe even a sprinkle of truth. It's worth pausing here to appreciate how odd this must have sounded in its time, even. Imagine walking into a room full of serious medical men and saying, in effect, I believe exposure to a disease from cows may protect people against one of the deadliest plagues on earth. Even now, with our modern technology and modern knowledge of viruses and immune systems and cross protection, this sounds strange when you phrase it bluntly. At the time, it sounded stranger still, but Jenner kept listening anyway. He was not the only person to ever really notice the connection. Others before him had observed links between cowpox and the resistance to smallpox. A Dorset farmer by the name of Benjamin Jesty had even used cowpox to protect his wife and children years earlier. There were scattered hints, partial experiments, scattered observations. But what Jenner did was organize the idea, test it, document it, and then prove it in a way that could not be ignored for the future. And that distinction is important. History often remembers not the first person to glimpse at a truth, but the first person who demonstrates it clearly enough to change the world. And that brings us to May 14th of 1796. The star of this episode is not just Jenner. It's also a milkmaid by the name of Sarah Nelms, an 8-year-old boy by the name of James Phipps, and a cow named Blossom. There's something almost comically pastoral about those details, which makes the outcome even more astonishing. Sarah had cowpox lesions on her hand, likely contracted from Blossom. Jenner took material from one of those lesions and used it to inoculate little James, the son of his gardener. He made small cuts in the boy's arm and introduced this cowpox matter. Ugh. James became mildly ill. He developed some fever and discomfort, but not a full catastrophe. So far, it was interesting, not revolutionary. And at this point, all Jenner had shown was that introducing cowpox caused cowpox. Important, perhaps, but hardly enough to rewrite medicine or the history thereof. The real test was still ahead. And this is where the story suddenly stops being a charming rural antidote and becomes something much more intense. Because the shocking part is that Jenner later deliberately exposed James Phipps to smallpox itself. Whew. Now, we tend to imagine the birth of vaccination as this calm and enlightened moment where science steps in and improves the human condition. In a broad sense, some of them, yes, that is true. But in the immediate human practical sense, what happened next was a gamble of terrifying proportions. Jenner had to know whether his theory actually worked. The only way in a world that he inhabited to prove that protection against smallpox was to challenge the boy with smallpox. He was just a boy. And so he did. And young James did not become ill. What an emotional force that had to be. Jenner had watched, he'd wondered, he had hypothesized, he had tested, and then the child remained well after exposure to one of humanity's greatest killers. The science in that result must have been almost deafening. No rash, there was no spiral into fever or pustules, there was no burial. There was just proof. Quiet, staggering proof. Now, from a modern perspective, people understandably recoil at the ethics of this. And they should. A doctor deliberately exposing a child to smallpox sounds like the kind of sentence that should immediately end in sirens and probably some legal consequences. But history does not happen inside modern ethics borders. It happens inside the circumstances in which people actually inhabited. Jenner was operating in a world where variolation was already common, where smallpox killed constantly, and where the danger of natural infection hung over every family. It doesn't make the act feel any more comfortable, but it does explain why he thought the test was necessary. Afterward, Jenner, of course, continued his work, repeating the process and collecting evidence, and then he tried to publish it, which naturally did not mean instant global applause. The Royal Society did not instantly rush to crown him a genius. There was a bunch of skepticism, there was hesitation, there was resistance, partially because the idea sounded really, really odd. And partially because medicine, like every human institution, is often slow to embrace a thing that sounds so ridiculous until it starts working embarrassingly well. Jenner revised his work. He expanded the evidence, and he published it himself. He described his cases and his reasoning. He gave the world not a rumor, but a medical argument, and that mattered. What he had created was not just an experiment, but a method. And then slowly, steadily, the thing began to spread, kind of like smallpox. The very word vaccination comes from vacca, the Latin word for cow. That detail alone is almost too perfect. One of the greatest medical breakthroughs in history is linguistically rooted in cattle. If smallpox had a sense of humor, that would have been a particularly annoying way to lose the fight. Of course, not everyone greeted this with gratitude and dignity. Some people were afraid. Some mocked the idea. Some genuinely believed that introducing cowpox into the body might somehow make people part cow. Caricatures appeared showing vaccinated individuals sprouting rather bovine features. This is one of those moments in history that should comfort anyone who thinks irrational panic around medicine is a modern invention. I promise you, it is not. Human beings have always been very good at meeting new science with a combination of confusion, suspicion, and remarkably creative nonsense. Still, evidence has a way of wearing people down. Vaccination was safer than variolation. It did not involve giving people actual smallpox. That's a huge bonus. It offered protection without the same level of risk. So governments took notice. Armies took notice. Even physicians took notice. Even Napoleon, who was not exactly in the business of sentimental praise for British country doctors, even he admired Jenner's work. At Jenner's request, Napoleon reportedly released British prisoners of war over this. That's a remarkable little side note. Imagine being so medically important that even a man who would rather not be impressed by you still ends up doing favors in your honor just because of who you are and what you've done. The discovery traveled fast. It crossed Europe. It reached the Americas. It was shared and carried to the colonies. It became the basis for vaccination campaigns. The Spanish Balmis expedition is one of the most astonishing chapters in history. The Spanish crown organized an effort to carry the vaccine across the Atlantic and into its overseas territories. And because refrigeration did not exist, the vaccine had to be kept alive from person to person, passed along a chain of children who carried the cowpox material in their bodies. If you want a reminder that the history of medicine can be both heroic and logistically bizarre, there it is. An empire trying to outrun disease by using a living human relay chain of immunity. In Britain, support grew. Parliament rewarded Jenner financially. Institutions were formed to promote the vaccination. Over time, inoculation with smallpox itself began to be replaced by vaccination with cowpox. And this is where the deeper significance of Jenner's work becomes clear. He did not simply improve treatment. He changed the relationship between humanity and one of its oldest enemies. Prevention no longer had to involve flirting so closely with the disease itself. And yet, as important as Jenner was, the story does not end there in 1796 or 1800 or even 1823 when Jenner died. If anything, his death shows how long the arc of this story really is. Jenner lived to see the vaccination spread, to see his work recognized, to see the tide turning. But he did not live to see smallpox gone. Not even close. The disease remained a global killer for generations after him. And this is how human victories work. The breakthrough moment gets one name and one date, but the actual triumph belongs to countless people across the decades. That later phase is worth lingering over, too, because it's easy to flatten history into Jenner did a thing and then smallpox vanished. It did not. Smallpox remained entrenched in many parts of the world. It continued killing on a monstrous scale through the 19th and well, even into the 20th century. It was still around when I was born. Vaccination campaigns expanded unevenly. Some states made vaccination compulsory. Others lagged. Some populations just accepted it. Others resisted. Access varied, enforcement varied, quality varied. Disease, especially this one, does not care whether your law was properly drafted or your public health logistics are feeling overworked this week. But gradually over time, the balance shifted. In parts of Europe and North America, vaccination pushed smallpox back. Cases dropped. Outbreaks became less frequent. Still, the diseases remained a major problem elsewhere. The 20th century, which we often imagine as medically advanced from the start, still saw smallpox raging in many regions. In 1967, the World Health Organization estimated there were still around 15 million cases every year. That number is a useful slap in the face for anyone tempted to imagine eradication as inevitable. It was not inevitable. It had to be done. The global eradication campaign that finally crushed smallpox is one of the greatest cooperative achievements in human history. Surveillance teams tracked outbreaks. Vaccinators moved quickly. Cases were isolated. Ring vaccinations were used to contain spread by vaccinating everyone around identified infections. It was not glamorous. It was exhausting, detailed, repetitive, and deeply human work. Field teams in villages, laboratories, health officials, transport workers, local guides, translators, community leaders, nurses, doctors, countless others. All of these people worked together to take Jenner's initial principle and turn it into a global weapon. There were immense obstacles. War zones, refugee movements, poor infrastructure, distrust, hate, distance, bureaucracy. But the campaign kept moving. And by 1975, the last known naturally occurring case of the severe form variola major had been identified in Bangladesh in a little girl named Rama Banu. By 1977, the last naturally occurring case of variola minor was identified in Somalia in Ali Mau Malin. In 1980, the World Health Organization declared smallpox eradicated. It's such a huge word that almost sounds unrealistic. We are used to hearing about control and reduction and management and mitigation and living without risk. Eradication sounds mythic. But in this case, it's real. Smallpox became the first human disease wiped from the natural world. It no longer stalks villages. It no longer fills graveyards. It no longer scars children's faces, blinds survivors, or kills monarchs in their beds. It survives only in secure laboratory stocks and in the memory of what it used to do. All thanks to one brilliant doctor. But there's one more irony in all of this that deserves a little smile, even in a story this grim. Smallpox had been spending centuries making humanity kneel. It had commanded fear from emperors, peasants, armies, mothers, doctors, and priests. It made itself one of the central facts of human existence. And in the end, one of the first decisive blows against it came from dairy lore and a cow named Blossom. History has a wicked sense of humor. Sometimes the giant falls because somebody notices the tiniest hinge on the door.